Amarjit Sada. Amarjit Sada, also known as Amardeep Sada, was 8 years old when he began his killing spree and earned himself the title of the world's youngest serial killer. His first victim was his 6-month-old cousin who had been left in his care by his aunt. Amarjit pinched and slapped her, taking delight as she cried helplessly. He then choked the baby to death, bashed her head with a brick, and buried her in a nearby forest. His parents shockingly chose to keep this horrific event a secret, probably due to fear of the shame of having to face the reality of their son's monstrous crime. Not long after, Amarjit moved on to his next victim, his 8-month-old sister. One afternoon while their parents slept, he picked her up from her cot and strangled her to death. Again, the parents chose silence for a second time. It wasn't until his third victim, a 6-month-old neighbor named Khushbu, that the police became involved. Khushbu's mother had left her sleeping safely at school while she attended to chores nearby. She later came back to find that Khushbu was nowhere to be seen. Villagers soon apprehended Amarjit, who confessed to killing Khushbu with a stone and burying her body nearby. As the police questioned Amarjit, they noted his calm and remorseless demeanor as he recounted his sickening crimes. He was sentenced to a juvenile home for rehabilitation, and upon turning 18 in 2016, he was released under a new identity. As of today, Amarjit Sada's whereabouts remain unknown. Mary Bell. Mary Bell was a 10-year-old girl who became one of Britain's youngest killers in 1968, along with her 13-year-old friend Norma Joyce Bell. Despite sharing a last name, the two were not related. Mary's first victim was 4-year-old Martin Brown, whom she murdered one day before her 11th birthday. She lured him to an abandoned house after convincing him that he had a sore throat and needed a throat massage to help relieve it. She then grabbed his neck and tightened her grip on his throat and didn't let go until his body went limp and lay lifeless. The body was discovered shortly after, but what followed was even more disturbing. Mary came back to the scene with her friend Norma Bell and displayed an unsettling curiosity about Martin's death. She kept pestering the victim's mother, asking to see Martin. When the grieving mom told her that Martin was dead, she replied, "Oh, I know he's dead. I want to see him in his coffin." She also left multiple notes claiming responsibility for the murder, notes that were initially dismissed as juvenile pranks by the police. But Mary's thirst for violence was far from quenched, as 2 months later, she and Norma targeted 3-year-old Brian Howe. They not only strangled Brian but also mutilated his body, carving an M into his stomach and cutting off some of his hair. Once the body was discovered, detectives began a manhunt for the killer and interviewed some 1,200 children, including Mary and Norma, before realizing that the two were the killers. In the trial that followed, Norma was acquitted of any wrongdoing, while Mary was sentenced to indefinite detention. She spent 12 years in custody before being released under a new anonymous identity at age 23 in 1980. John Venables and Robert Thompson. On February 12, 1993, a grainy CCTV image captured the moment these two 10-year-old boys led a toddler away by the hand, a seemingly innocent scene that masked a terrible crime. To onlookers, it appeared as if they were helping a lost child or were simply innocent siblings, but the reality was far darker. They had abducted 2-year-old James Bulger from a shopping center in Bootle, Merseyside in the UK. They walked James for over 2 miles through town. Eventually, they led James to a secluded railway embankment where their twisted intentions became clear. They mercilessly kicked him, stamped on him, and hit him with bricks and stones. Finally, the boys dropped a heavy railway fishplate on him, which inflicted 10 fractures on his skull. Little James had suffered a total of 42 different injuries on his body by the time the two boys were done with their brutal attack. They attempted to cover up their murderous tracks by laying him across the railway tracks, hoping that a train would strike him and mask their crime as an accident. After they left, a train struck his body and cut it in half. 2 days later, the body was discovered. Venables and Thompson were arrested after being identified based on the CCTV footage of the two abducting James. They were found guilty of murder, making them the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. They were sentenced to indefinite detention at Her Majesty's pleasure. Venables and Thompson spent 8 years in youth custody before being released under new identities in 2001. Jesse Pomeroy. At just 14 years old, He would become one of America's youngest serial killers, earning the horrifying title of the Boston Boy Fiend. In 1871, at the age of 11 years, Jesse committed his first known crime. He began to lure young boys into secluded areas where he would subject them to horrific acts of torture. He would tie them up, beat them, and even use a knife to inflict pain. This sadistic behavior went largely unnoticed until he was caught in the act and sentenced to a reform school. Just a few months after his release in 1874, Jesse's violent impulses resurfaced with deadly intent. He kidnapped and brutally murdered a 4-year-old boy named Horace Mullen. Jesse lured Horace to a nearby swamp where he savagely slashed the child with a knife, so brutally that he nearly decapitated him. Shortly after killing Horace, he turned his attention to another victim, 10-year-old Katie Curran. He lured her into his home and subjected her to similar horrors before ultimately taking her life as well. The police were baffled by these brutal murders. They had never encountered such savagery from someone so young. As suspicion began to mount against him due to his previous behavior, investigators started connecting the dots. When they found Horace's body, they quickly turned their attention to Jesse. After a series of interrogations and mounting evidence against him, Jesse confessed to both murders with chilling nonchalance. During his trial in 1876, Jesse was found guilty but deemed insane. The court sentenced him to life in prison at the State Prison for Boys in Westboro. In 1911, after spending nearly 40 years in confinement, Jesse Pomeroy was finally released from prison at the age of 52. He spent the remainder of his life in relative obscurity until he died on September 29, 1932. Craig Price. Craig Price was just 13 years old when he committed his first murder in 1987. On a hot summer night in 1987, Craig broke into the home of 27-year-old Rebecca, armed with nothing but a knife and a twisted desire for violence. Craig stabbed Rebecca 58 times in a frenzied attack that left her lifeless on the floor. Fast forward 2 years to September 1, 1989. Craig was now 15 and high on a cocktail of marijuana and LSD when he struck again. This time, he targeted Joan Heaton and her 2 young daughters, Jennifer and Melissa. He butchered Joan with kitchen knives she had bought earlier that day, 57 stab wounds in total. The horror escalated as he turned on her daughters. Jennifer witnessed her mother's murder and was stabbed 62 times before she could call for help. 8-year-old Melissa suffered a similar fate. Her skull was crushed after enduring 30 stab wounds. The scene was so gruesome that the blades of the knives broke off inside the victims' bodies. As news of the murders spread through Warwick, the police were on high alert. It wasn't long before Craig became the prime suspect. Police had become suspicious after Price lied about a deep gash on his finger. They knew from the crime scene that the killer had cut himself. They discovered a bloody sock print that matched Price's size 13 feet and found the knives hidden in his backyard shed. When confronted by police, Craig sat there calmly confessing to all 4 murders with chilling nonchalance and a complete lack of remorse. In the trial that followed, Craig was convicted for the murders and held in a correctional facility. He was to be released after turning 21, but as of today, he remains incarcerated in Florida after being sentenced to an additional 25 years for attempting to murder another inmate with a makeshift knife. Graham Young. Graham Young had a deadly fascination with chemistry which transformed him into one of Britain's youngest serial killers. His weapon of choice? Poison. Born in 1947 in London, Graham began experimenting with poisons on his unsuspecting family at age 14. He would lace food and drinks with various substances, watching with morbid curiosity as his victims suffered from mysterious illnesses. His stepmother Molly was among the first to fall victim to his deadly experiments. After consuming food tainted with antimony, she experienced severe vomiting and stomach pain, which she initially dismissed as a simple ailment. But Graham's experiments escalated quickly. On Easter Saturday in 1962, Molly succumbed to her ailments and died. Officially, her death was attributed to a prolapsed cervical disc from a car accident, but Graham later confessed that he had poisoned her with thallium, a potent toxin. Not long after her death, he poisoned a male relative and attempted to poison his father and sister as well. The alarming pattern of illness in his household raised suspicions among family members and eventually led to an investigation. It wasn't long before authorities caught wind of Graham's sinister activities. On May 23, 1962, police found vials of thallium and antimony in his possession after he returned home from school. When questioned, he confessed to poisoning multiple family members and even detailed his methods with unsettling pride. A psychiatrist described him as having a psychopathic disorder. He lacked any normal moral sense and expressed a chilling fascination with the power that poisons gave him. Graham was sentenced to Broadmoor Hospital for 9 years, one of the youngest inmates ever admitted there. While confined, he continued to study poisons and chemistry, honing his skills under the guise of rehabilitation. Upon his release in 1970, Graham seemed like a reformed man but soon went back to his old ways. In 1971, he befriended Trevor Sparks, a 34-year-old man who would become his next victim. Graham poisoned Sparks with antimony sodium tartrate after offering him a drink laced with the deadly substance. Sparks fell violently ill that night before dying shortly thereafter. The authorities soon linked Graham to Sparks' death when they discovered traces of poison in his system during the investigation. Once again, Graham found himself behind bars, this time for murder. He was convicted of Sparks' murder in 1972 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died on August 1, 1990, while still incarcerated at the age of 42. Edmund Kemper. Edmund committed his first murders at just 15 years of age. In August 1964, after an argument with his grandmother, he shot her in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. When his grandfather returned home from grocery shopping, Edmund shot him as well. He then called the police himself and waited calmly for them to arrive. After being found insane at his trial, Edmund was sent to a psychiatric hospital instead of prison. During his time there, he underwent treatment and was eventually released in 1969 at the age of 21. But freedom did not lead to reform, but instead unleashed a new horrific killing spree between May 1972 and April 1973. Kemper targeted young women, specifically college students who were hitchhiking in Santa Cruz County. He would pick them up in his car, charm them with conversation, and then take them to isolated areas where he would brutally murder them. The number of victims quickly climbed as he killed a total of 8 people during this period: 5 college students, 1 high school student, his mother, and his mother's best friend. Kemper's reign of terror came to an end when he turned himself in on April 24, 1973. He confessed to all 8 murders during police interrogation with an eerie calmness that shocked investigators. In November 1973, Kemper was found sane and guilty at his trial. He requested the death penalty for his crimes. However, capital punishment was suspended in California at that time. Instead, he received 8 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. Today, Edmund Kemper remains incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville.